my welcome remarks. I've been on top of a few mountains in my life, and I've had some pretty spiritual moments on those mountains. I've had a few real soul-cleansing breaths. I've left a lot of junk on top of mountains, not literal junk, but just sort of emotional baggage. I've really come face to face with God on mountains. But truth be told, I would never write a fantastical story like the one we just read that took place on top of that kind of mountain. This is arguably, most scholars would admit, one of the more strange stories in sort of the corpus, the body of stories that we have about Jesus while he walked the earth. We've got doves descending from above saying, "This is my beloved son," and, we've got, people coming back to life and people being healed from illnesses. There are other, granted, miraculous and rather strange stories. But this one is particularly different in that Jesus actually takes on sort of this new, spectacular form, this dazzling appearance. And two forgotten characters, not mentioned all that frequently in the New Testament, make their appearance as well. And out of the blue, Jesus has a rather nonchalant conversation with them. And it leaves the disciples rather afraid. I've also been there before, by the way, on top of a mountain and a little bit afraid. There are a few mountains when you get right to the precipice can feel exhilarating in all the wrong ways. So I've had the gamut of emotions here that we find in this Transfiguration Sunday piece. And I wanted to reflect a little bit on what exactly we might take away from this story here today. Strange story though it is. What is it that we can learn from Jesus' encounter with his disciples and the stories of Moses and Elijah? Maybe just a quick reflection for those of you that may be less familiar with some of the Old Testament stories and aren't quite recalling everything. Moses, of course, was the first really great leader of Israel, was the one that called them out of Egypt. And when he led them with his brother Aaron out of the land of Egypt, they found themselves in the Sinai wilderness. And there we have several stories of Moses going up a mountain, and they're having encounters with God. Theologians call these encounters with God, these moments when one sees maybe even God, we call them theophanies. And so Moses is famous for a number of these theophanies. Perhaps the one you're most familiar with is receiving the Ten Commandments. That's how the story goes in Exodus. Elijah's different, you see. Elijah's story is one of a sort of brazen and bold prophet, willing to take on whatever Elijah encounters, whatever he sees. And of course, during Elijah's prophetic role with Israel, Israel has wandered off. They are worshiping all sorts of other gods. There's idolatrous stuff happening. And there's a wicked, evil queen. We call her Jezebel. And Elijah has this encounter on top of a mountain. Does anybody remember the name of that mountain? Mount Carmel, actually. Mount Carmel. And on top of Mount Carmel, Elijah battles mano a mano all of these other priests. And there's this showdown of gods and religious activity. And Elijah prays that God would show up by eviscerating a waterlogged altar and offering. Perhaps another time we'll go to the book of Kings and preach on that story, because it's an interesting one. But a lot of people forget how these stories move on past the mountaintop experience. And we'll get to that shortly, because I think a lot of times we read this transfiguration story and it's on top of a mountain. We're like, of course Moses is there. Moses spent time on mountains. Of course Elijah is there. The culminating story in Elijah's sort of experience was on top of a mountain. And we sort of leave it there. But today, there is a different kind of application for these immense religious experiences. We need mountaintop experiences, don't you? How many of you would suggest you don't need mountaintop experiences in your life? And what do I mean by that metaphorical mountaintop? Those times in life when you encounter the sense that you belong, the sense that you are somewhere, the sense of the beauty and grandeur of the world around you, the beauty and grandeur of the relationships of the people with you. We all need mountaintop experiences. We all need those times to be reminded that maybe, just maybe, there is something beyond that transcends the mundane nature of day-to-day life. And that's really what this story is, and I want to pick up on Peter just a little bit. Did you catch what Peter said when sort of Jesus transforms and Elijah and Moses appear? Do you guys remember what Peter's words were? Peter's like, great! This is what I want my religious experience to be. He looks around and he says, this is perfect. Moses, are you kidding me? The legend? Elijah, Mount Carmel, oh my goodness. These are like mythical people in their bedtime stories. Every Jewish young person would have heard these stories frequently, from the synagogues, from their parents at bedtime. These were important stories. And so Peter's like, whoa, Jesus, Moses, Elijah, it can all stop right here. I don't need to go any further. And that's precisely what Peter says. Peter's like, listen, Jesus, I got you. This is what we've been waiting for. Do you want me to build some houses? Maybe we just stay here forever. Maybe we just stay here forever, Jesus. I'll just build some houses. Like, we don't need to go anywhere. I've been there. I've been at the top of the mountain, and I've dreaded the trek back down the mountain. I've thought to myself, I wonder if I could just stay up here. Like, what if I just forget everything else? What if I forget all of the pressures of life? What if I forget everything else that's happening down at sea level? What if I just stay and every morning I see the sun come up over the peaks? I watch, maybe I bathe in some mountain fresh glacier lake. It'd be pretty hard for me maybe to find vegetation, but I'll figure it out. Like, maybe I just stay on top of the mountain. And for some of us, that's what we want. We want life to just be a permanent mountaintop experience. We're just looking for the good times, the sweet times. And Jesus is quick to correct Peter. In fact, what I think is most amazing about this story is not so much that it happened, but that Jesus looks Peter in the face and the other disciples in the face, and he says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of what's down there. Yeah, we needed this mountaintop experiences. You guys needed to be affirmed in your faith that I indeed am the Son of God. This experience was important in your ability to go back down into the muck of everyday living. We need those refreshing moments. We need those abilities to sort of cut ties with the emails and the telephone calls and all the harassing ideas of just life in general. And we need to get away. We need holidays. We need mountaintops. We need to just breathe in the mountain air. We need to stop hearing the traffic of the city. All of the noise of the city. We need those times. They are what help us when we find ourselves right back in the thick of it. And this is what makes this story particularly awesome. Jesus doesn't stay on the mountaintop with them. In fact, if this story means anything, it's a call back into what Jesus really showed up to do. You see, this was like one line in the New Testament of a dazzling, shimmering, glowing Jesus. And for many in their religious mindset, that's kind of what they think of God, as this, shimmering, blazing We just sang it, shine, Jesus, shine. And yes, but where did Jesus shine the brightest? And that's the whole premise of the story. Jesus takes those disciples and he says, I am going to be with you right down in the muck of everything. So I think the most miraculous point of this story, let me catch up to my notes if I need them. The most remarkable part of the story is not so much that Jesus sends his disciples back down the mountain. The most remarkable part of this story is that Jesus joins them at the bottom of the mountain. Jesus walks back down the mountain with them. Transfiguration Sunday, if it means anything to us today, is that God invites us to the mountaintop experiences. And we're going to have those. You're going to have those. You're going to have them in your personal day-to-day life. You're going to have them in your professional life. And you're going to have them in your spiritual life if you open yourselves up to those encounters with God. And they may just very well be on top of a mountain, believe it or not. But what I really want to remind you of today is that Jesus walks back down the mountain with us. Heaven and earth meet in the person of Jesus. We can be assured of the fact that Jesus will walk that journey back down to sea level, back down to the noise of the city, back down to the noise of your thoughts, back into the muck and mire of day-to-day living. Jesus is there. And if Christianity is anything, it's a call to know that Jesus is in the pain and in the suffering. Jesus shone bright on the Mount of Transfiguration, but Jesus shone way brighter on the cross. In a few weeks' time, we'll march right back in, march, walk, whatever, celebrate our way right back into our new facility. And a cornerstone piece of what that new facility looks like is this amazing stained glass window of which we are all rather enamored. And guess what the stained glass window is of? Jesus on a cross. Unusual, frankly, for a Protestant congregation. Not that common. Crosses, yes. Jesus on a cross, not so much. But you know what? Theologically, so profound. Because I believe, while Jesus shone for a sentence in Transfiguration in a dazzling way, several chapters of every one of the Gospels focuses on the cross. If there was ever a time that you needed Jesus most, it's when the pain and the suffering and the challenges of life are the greatest. And the cross is that moment in time when Jesus shone the brightest. And so on this Transfiguration Sunday, as we close, I just want to remind you. I just want to remind you that Jesus is with us. The divine summons to the top of the mountain doesn't end on the top of the mountain. Those are resets, refreshes, recharges that allow us to walk back down the mountain and to engage in the work of justice making, to engage in the work of healing those who are brokenhearted, to engage in the work of allowing ourselves to experience God in our pain, in our suffering, and in those places. God invites us to shine the brightest. So, as we reflect on our mountaintop experiences and the pain of walking back down the mountain, often the most tiring part of a hike is going back down. I invite you to remember that Jesus is walking right alongside you.